Good afternoon and welcome to this expository preaching and teaching video on how to build an expository sermon. Building an expository sermon is probably one of the more important things that you will do as a preacher. And so with building an expository sermon, you must first understand what expository preaching is. Or an expository sermon, I'd rather. So an expository sermon is a sermon that seeks to explain and apply a specific passage of scripture. So that is the key point of this. You want to pick a specific scripture and you want to fill it out and you want to read between all the lines and you want to get the most meat off of the bone with that particular scripture. So in doing that, there are things that you must remember. In expository preaching and teaching, the few things that we want to highlight of importance are the delivery. Be sure that your delivery is clear. Be sure that everybody follows the context in which you're speaking about. You also want to be sure that your message is biblically grounded and biblically sound, because there are a lot of people who will prepare a message and they don't even touch what we call the text. So in that, we must come to the conclusion that if you're going to preach an expository sermon, that you must pick a text. That is the first portion of building an expository sermon. You must pick a text. I tell most people when I'm helping them with their with their ministries, that when you pick a text, it's important to pray to God and also scan the room to see the things that you need to deal with in the spirit. Once you've come up with a text, I cannot say this enough. Study, study, study. The Bible teaches us that one is supposed to study to show themselves approved so that they can rightfully divide the word of truth. I say this over and over and over. It is the worst thing ever that a preacher can pick a text and preach about it and it not be effective because they did not study. So studying must be adamant. It is also important that you use different tools and methods for contextual analysis and textual analysis, things like commentaries and lexicons and concordances. I personally use the Matthew Henry commentaries. So any good commentary that is in date and in depth will help you with better understanding your sermon. Before you can preach a sermon to anyone, you must first have a clear understanding of the text at hand. So you must emphasize the need of this text. You also must emphasize why this text is important. In building this expository sermon, you must put together a structure. The structure is the introduction, the body, and the conclusion. A lot of times in your structure, you ask different questions to help build the body of the sermon that you are building. So the first questions you would ask are who, what, when, where, and why. These questions typically help the preacher or the message bearer or the word bearer with what's going on in the text by reading about or by knowing or having knowledge about what is happening in the background of the text. It actually makes some of the things that are going on in the text make more sense and makes them more correlatable to the life that we are living in present day. And that is another thing that you want to make sure that you are doing, is that you're reaching those listeners and those parishioners, and you're correlating the text to the commonalities of what we are dealing with in the modern day. So you have the introduction, the body, and the conclusion. So building a good introduction to a good sermon is pretty much based upon telling a story that correlates with their senses or that appeals to things that they like. I always tell stories to help bring people in by using movies or book quotes or things that can correlate to the message that I am reading, or pretty much give the message within the quote or the illustration that I'm using. So who, what, when, where, and why? These are questions that need to be asked. And you also have to understand and make known in your sermon building why certain parts of your who, what, when, where, and why that go into your body serve the overall message, and what purpose do they have. You have to develop a main idea. So when you're building a sermon, the first question you want to ask is, what is it that I really want to say? Once you get that down, you take the scripture that you have selected and you make your talking points based around the main idea of the text, or the central theme of your sermon. You must put supporting points and subpoints in your message. This allows you to open the door to the text and give you a personal place to testify on your own personal journey. For example, if I use John 1:1 and I say, in the beginning was the Word was God, and the Word was with God. The Word was with God, the Word was God. And when you say that, you have to have a clear understanding of who God is. And when you do that, telling people who God is, you're giving your personal explanation or personal synopsis to everybody else of who God is. And once you learn who God is, you're able to testify to the fact that God is who he is in your life, allowing your introduction to reach those who are listening to you, so that you can turn the introduction into the body of the message. When you get to the conclusion of your message, you pretty much are asking, so what's your point? You've told me who, what, when, where, and why. So what is the point of you preaching this? And when you get to the so what now, or what's your point, you also have to be able to follow up with a conclusion or a close that calls for application for the things that you have mentioned in your sermon to be put in place in other people's lives. So let me say it like this. Application and illustration both play a heavy part in expository sermons. A lot of times people hear what you're saying, but sometimes you have those who have to see what you're saying. So illustrations are good. Illustrations help people who have a hard time grasping the totality of the word. Illustrations also help paint a prettier picture so that people can grasp the totality of the message that you are trying to send. And as you do that, in summary of all of these, you must also think of delivery techniques. What I mean by delivery techniques is you have to figure out the places where you interject your voice, where your voice needs to be heavier in most times than others. Typically, these are times where you have an agreement with your audience, or when you are trying to convey a key point that you don't want your parishioners or your listeners to forget. You also have to practice preaching this to yourself. You also have to practice your message so that you're familiar with the script at hand. It's good to have manuscript in front of you just in case you get lost, but it's also good to familiarize yourself with not only just the text that you're preaching, but also the sermon that you've written. This shows others that you've taken the time to be familiar with what God has told you and the very things that God wanted you to say to the people who are listening to you. So the purpose of all of this video is to help anybody in this position be able to create a positive and impactful expository sermon. Remember, you start with the scripture, you seek God through prayer. In your praying, you also listen for God to speak to the subject matter that you are trying to address. In that, you write down your who, what, when, where, and why. This is where you pick up your body and most of your talking points. And then you make time for your conclusion. Now, in the conclusion, you must be sure that everything that you addressed in your body, you have sound biblical ways for people to apply these things that you have been preaching in your own or in their own lives. So we thank you for your time. We thank you for doing this, but most importantly, study, 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 and be sure that you are taking in the totality of the text, that you are taking time to study the key points and the major theme points in the text so that you can deliver a positive expository sermon. Thank you.